Good morning, everybody, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to the third and final day of the National Innovation Conference. I'm very pleased to introduce to you our third and final speaker of the conference, Professor John Bessant. John is a professor in innovation and entrepreneurship at the University of Exeter. Whilst originally a chemical engineer, he has been teaching, researching, and indeed consulting in the area of innovation for over 25 years now. He has published over 30 books and monographs in the area of innovation and has published in many of the leading international journals. John is going to talk to you today about scaling innovation for SMEs. And in particular, he'll focus on the challenges of scaling and also how we need to take a systematic approach to scaling. So I'm very pleased to hand you over to John now, and I hope you enjoy the talk.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to another exploration around this wonderful theme of innovation. My name's John Bessant. I'm Emeritus Professor at the University of Exeter, and I'd like to share some thoughts with you today about what I call the journey to scale. Let me begin with a couple of stories. This gentleman here. Now, his name's Earl Tupper, and from the name you might already guess what he actually came up with, amongst many other things, was Tupperware. He was a chemist and he'd worked in the plastics industry, and he'd found a way of, almost like an alchemist, turning waste into gold. He took waste material from oil refining and converted it to a bright, colorful plastic with a clever seal, which he patented. The only problem that he had with this wonderful product, Tupperware, was that nobody bought it. And he took a long time and tried a lot of techniques, but couldn't really move the needle on sales. Until this woman appeared on the scene. And this woman's name is Brownie Wise. And she basically was the magic ingredient in the Tupperware story. She didn't invent it, but she took on board the idea of the home party as the model for selling the product. And basically took the idea in her own company, Polly Tea Parties, and ran parties in people's homes where they could see and play with Tupperware products. She had a number of party tricks, amongst other things. She'd fill a Tupperware with liquid, throw it right across the room, and surprise, surprise, the seal held and the liquid inside didn't spill out all over the furniture. But what she really did in those Tupperware parties was provide a way of communicating the innovation, and doing so in a social setting. It was a party, there was conversation, food and drink. The innovation was just one of the various things that happened during the evening. What she then did was build a sales force made up of women who'd hosted parties, who began to see a part-time career opportunity. And she built a sales empire for Earl Tupper. The entire product range was only sold through parties and became an incredible success. So there's a story with a happy ending of moving a good innovation from being an innovation to being one which diffuses to scale. Let's look at another story. Sweeping floors is something we've had to do since time immemorial, and we've developed various technologies to help us. This man in particular had a strong interest in technology to help. His name was J. Murray Spangler, and he was working at the time as a janitor in a department store in Ohio. And after hours cleaning the place, he was struggling with all the dust and dirt, which particularly aggravated his lungs as he was an asthmatic. So he worked long and hard to come up with a better solution, which he also patented. He came up with the world's first electric vacuum suction sweeper. But nobody's ever heard of Mr. Spangler. They do, however, recognize something that happened with Mr. Spangler, which was that he sold the product that he'd made to a housewife who found it wonderful, so much so that she enthused about it to her husband. So just at the time when Mr. Spangler was wondering how on earth he was going to make ends meet, he'd got a product, but he couldn't scale or sell it, Mr. Hoover came on the scene. And of course, that's the name we associate very much with the vacuum cleaner. Once again, then, a story with eventually a happy ending, but not just a story of an innovation, but a story of how that eventually came to scale. One more story from a very different world entirely. This is sadly a picture of a famine, and unfortunately, we still have a lot of natural and man-made famines around the world. And we've developed solutions, innovations to deal with it. In the early days, when we had a lot of surplus food, we'd simply take our surplus food, bag it up, and ship it to places where it was needed. But we began to get better at managing our farms, so we didn't have so much food to waste. And it also didn't make sense to ship it halfway around the world if we could use money to buy it locally. But the real move to scale in terms of that sector was when we began to give people money directly. Today, the way food aid is delivered is to give people a credit card or possibly now a mobile phone, but using that as a way of transferring money through which people can make their own purchases of the food and medicine and other things that they need. Now, once again, that's an innovation which has radically transformed disaster relief, but it didn't happen overnight. Like the other stories, it was a long journey from early experiments back in 1985 to today, finally, when this becomes the dominant way of giving food aid. But there we are, 3 stories, all of them illustrating the main point I want to talk about today, the challenge of scale. Now, lots of scale isn't about success in those happy ending stories, it's about failure. This, for example, is a company called Better Place, and the name kind of tells you what kind of business it was about. It was the brainchild of an Israeli, Shai Agassi, who wanted to make the world a better place, particularly his country Israel, but more generally the world, through electromobility, electric cars. He had a wonderful idea, a very good idea, for battery swap technology, and he was pretty good at selling, to the point that pitching his idea, he raised for its time in 2010, the most venture capital for a single new venture, around $200 million, and got the backing of the chairman of Renault-Nissan and the ex-prime minister of Israel. So a tremendous movement in favor of his idea, which unfortunately never moved to scale. This is another product. This one is a success. This was one of the first widely selling home computers back in the 1980s. This is the Sinclair ZX Spectrum. And as far as the UK is concerned, any boy of that age group at that time will almost certainly have had a Sinclair Spectrum and learned to program and essentially launched the home computer. The man behind that was Clive Sinclair. So a successful innovator, a very good electronics engineer, and someone who knew a thing or two about scale. But just knowing doesn't guarantee you succeed. This was one of his less successful ventures. This was an early attempt, again, at electromobility. This is a kind of cross between an e-bike and a small tricycle kind of motor vehicle. The Sinclair C5 completely failed for all sorts of reasons. It became almost a laughingstock. But it came from the same man as had given us the very successful home computer industry. So there's a big challenge in scale, and it's not just about making stupid mistakes. In fact, there's a wonderful museum in Sweden called the Museum of Failure, which is full of exhibits of innovations, many of them from household name companies, Apple, Coke, all sorts of companies, basically who, although they're normally successful, manage to have failures. One of my particular favorites, for example, is this from the Gerber company. Gerber, big name in baby foods, very successful food manufacturer, but not all of its innovations succeeded and certainly didn't move to scale. This was one which was developed with the nice idea that we're increasingly short of time, but we're therefore not necessarily getting the right kind of food at breakfast. So what about a jar of food you could quickly microwave and spoon your way through a delicious or otherwise meal of beef burgundy or Mediterranean vegetables? It's essentially baby food for adults. Perhaps not surprisingly, this one also failed to move to scale. But remember, these are not innovations that were simply ideas that failed. They'd gone through the development process, the test marketing and so on. They'd moved a long way down the road before they crashed on their journey to scale. So scale's important. But I'd also like to suggest that in the world of innovation and thinking about how we manage innovation, it's a bit of a Cinderella story. Innovation, as I've said, is about creating value from ideas. And we've learned a lot, and we've spent a lot of time in recent years worrying about the front end of innovation. We've got lots of tools and models to help us come up with ideas, to develop the venture, to test it out, to prototype. We're pretty good at the front end of innovation. But downstream, that longer journey to scale, to widespread adoption, perhaps that's been a bit neglected. It's a little bit like the Cinderella story. The one who quietly got on in the background, doing the stuff, keeping the house clean, while all the attention was focused on the two sisters and the big ball that they were going to. Now, the good news about innovation in this sense is that there's a lot of good information hidden beneath the ashes and dirt in which our Cinderella works. Basically, we do know quite a lot about this scaling question. And so what I'd like to do for the rest of this talk is just pick up very briefly 5 areas of insight which might be worth rediscovering to help us think about our journey to scale. So let's begin with what's classically called diffusion theory. Effectively, what affects the S-curve? Innovations, as you'll appreciate, don't instantly happen from being invented to instantly being adopted by everyone. What happens is that over time, a few people try something out. If they have success, others look over their shoulders, say they like that, and gradually you have a pattern where more people adopt something, the curve accelerates, until in the end, as it tails off, it's just the few diehards who are very reluctant to adopt. Now, whether we talk about color televisions or new farming techniques or anything you like, innovations follow an S-curve. That, of course, begs the question, what affects it? And particularly if we're innovators, how might we make that curve as steep and as fast as possible? Well, this man could help us answer that question. His name's Everett Rogers, and it was his life's work to try and understand the diffusion of innovations. Why do people adopt new things? His book ran to several editions and essentially distilled thousands of different studies in many, many different contexts, but with the same question. Why do people adopt new things? How does this process work? And Rogers came up with a very elegant and simple model based on 4 sets of characteristics. A hugely important thing, accounts for perhaps 80% of the adoption behavior, is how we perceive the innovation. Particularly key characteristics: how much better is it than what it will replace? How complex is it? Can we understand it, or does it seem a bit strange? How visible is it? Seeing is believing, a very powerful way of convincing ourselves something is better. Being able to try it out before we have to fully commit. And really importantly, how well does it fit with our world? Now, these are powerful characteristics, a great checklist for thinking about any innovation, but the key word here is perceived. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and innovation, success, attractiveness, whatever, is very much in how we perceive things. The whole advertising industry is predicated on this. What advertisers try and do is tell us a story on TV or in articles, basically playing up the relative advantage, telling us how visibly this is much better than what it's replacing. This detergent washes whiter than white, giving us a chance to try things out, a trial size before we commit. In all sorts of ways, what advertising does is try and massage or shape our perceptions of an innovation's characteristics. So a great deal there to work with. But Rogers also looked at the people adopting and made the very obvious point that people aren't all the same in their attitudes to new things. Some like to adopt new things just because they're new. Some will take them quite early on, the early adopters. Others will wait and see what the early adopters do and then follow them. In other words, adopter behavior is distributed over time. And importantly, and we'll come back to this, social influence matters. We do value what other people do in their adoption behavior, and that helps shape ours. The converse of that, of course, is how are we perceived as the ones introducing something new, the innovator characteristics. And once again, a lot of very relevant advice in terms of how we might diffuse an innovation. One of the big reasons behind the Tupperware success story was that instead of a pushy salesman pushing his foot in the door and trying to get us to buy the Tupperware, it took place with housewives talking to other housewives in the safe context of a domestic party. In other words, the innovator was very much perceived as somebody like me. And as human beings, we trust people like us. The other thing in Roger's model was the environment, that sometimes things in the environment can accelerate or slow down adoption. And of course, sometimes those environmental things are unpredictable. Sometimes we can shape the environment to our advantage. But I'd like to suggest if we wanted to start by wondering how we could move something to scale, there's not a much better starting place than looking at the diffusion theory and what we've learned. And if I were to push one single book, it would be Everett Rogers and all his ideas around what shapes that. But another insight really asks the question, what or who else do you need to move to scale? Now, if I were to suggest that there were opportunities in the world of remote retailing, that you could sell something to people who may not be able to get to the shops, as long as you could find the mechanisms to procure it for them, to make them aware of it, to get it to them, and to sort out all the finances, you're probably thinking of Amazon. But actually, I wasn't. I was thinking 100 years earlier of these gentlemen, Mr. Sears and Mr. Roebuck, because they basically anticipated what Jeff Bezos did with online retailing 100 years before. The whole of the Sears-Roebuck model was essentially about how to reach remote farmsteads and bring them anything they wanted through the vehicle of the catalogue and beyond. But of course, the clever thing was not the idea, it was its realization. And in order to realize something like that, what you need are logistics skills, you need skills in advertising, in producing the catalogue. You very much need skills in sales and distribution, making sure the stuff gets to people. And you've got to be pretty hot on the finances to make sure the cash flow works. You have the money before the product goes to the customer. So what they really did was pull together the complementary assets to make their system of innovation work, which is, of course, what Brownie Wise helped Earl Tupper do in terms of the Tupperware story. It's what Mr. Hoover did to help Mr. Spangler get his product to the real world. And it's what the middle gentleman here, Mr. Remington, did for the gentleman on the left, Mr. Christopher Scholes, who came up with the typewriter. Once again, the typewriter, another great idea, a proven invention, an innovation which had some small success. It moved to scale by getting in partnership with an organization, Remington, who knew about scale manufacture. They built a lot of the weapons for the American Civil War. They knew about how to make things at scale, and they knew the logistics, the distribution, the financing, and so on. Complementary assets matter. And that really leads us to the third insight, and one of great relevance today, ecosystems, one of those buzzwords about innovation, but really these are networks through which value is created. This gentleman probably isn't a face you recognize. His name is Thomas Uzelaks. On the other hand, this gentleman is a face you probably do recognize, Steve Jobs. Between them, they revolutionized the way we consume music because they were pioneers in their different ways of the MP3, the sort of thing that drives the iTunes platform and many others today. The difference is that Thomas Uzelaks actually invented the MP3 player and had small success in selling it. What Steve Jobs realized was it isn't simply having a device which can digitize your music and make it portable. What you also need are to work with the people who create the music, the artists, the record companies and others who own it, the distributors. In other words, he needed to pull together in iTunes a whole set of different players to create a network of value. Toshiba. Toshiba, certainly not a slouch in terms of innovation. Amongst their many other successes, they gave the world the notebook computer. They were the pioneers of the portable laptop, which effectively so many people carry around today. Toshiba, however, didn't make it to scale, perhaps disastrously in terms of the $1 billion or so it cost them. But in their DVD wars, they lost out with high definition DVD to Sony and Blu-ray. And whilst there were all sorts of things going on, really the main difference was at the ecosystem level. Toshiba had a great product, knew how to make it at scale, but didn't really have titles, films, and other things to put on its discs. Sony, of course, by contrast, because of its links to the studios, was able to put together a whole library of films that people could watch on their discs. In other words, they had the better ecosystem. Now, two names probably not familiar. The first is in Cyrillic, the word is Yandex, and the words underneath mean find anything or find everything. And Alibaba.com, something in China. Yandex speaks, of course, to the Russian-speaking world. Alibaba is hugely present in the China world, but they're basically versions of what we are more familiar with, Google, Amazon, platform businesses. And just like Google and Amazon, it's not about doing one thing. It's not just about selling books. All sorts of things operate across those platforms. Yandex has its version of Uber. It has a food delivery service. It has financial services, online retailing, all sorts of things, essentially networks of value. Not all delivered by the Yandex or the Alibaba or the Amazon company, but by people working on their platforms to supply a much bigger market. They are platform businesses, ecosystems of value. Toyota have been doing this for a long, long time. Toyota have built a very successful ecosystem of value around how it creates and gets a motor car to us. And that, of course, is not just about what Toyota as a company does, even though it's a big one. It's about the many, many suppliers. What Toyota was able to do was work with those suppliers to create shared value. And importantly, to continue to innovate across that network. Toyota built a system by lending engineers to provide new knowledge, by getting the different players together, essentially creating a network which is still world famous, a network of suppliers to support what it's trying to do to deliver cars. And this is an example that reminds us this doesn't have to happen only in the in the commercial sector. Let's Localize is a fascinating platform which is trying to do something at scale, which most communities do. Most communities will support their local school because it's in their interests. Schools have a need for resources, but also for parents' time, for equipment, for various other things. What Let's Localize does is say, let's bring the different players together. The schools, of course, the parents and their associations, local shops and businesses. Let's try and bring these different people together to meet on a platform and create shared value. And having done it for one school in one area, let's scale this across the whole of the country. It's another version of what Google and Amazon, Yandex, Toyota, others are doing. It's creating an ecosystem. So what are we learning about building ecosystems and how might that help us in our journey to scale? Perhaps the most important point, we need to understand the architecture of value creation. Innovation is creating value from ideas, but it doesn't just happen. And in particular, it requires many different players coming together. Only when they all work together, all those different elements, will we really create value. So we need to understand the architecture. And of course, the word which beautifully describes that is the business model. The business model is basically a statement of the architecture of value creation. Working with business models is fine. We then move to a position where we think about where the key points are in that business model where we can exert leverage. This is why Apple sits at the center of the online platform today around their iPhone, why Google is at the center of its huge platform, why Yandex is. Essentially, this is about building an ecosystem, but also strategically positioning yourself within it. It's also about collaboration, about sharing the gains. It's looking for win-win outcomes rather than a zero win-lose one. And it's looking for everybody taking a share. This was perhaps the real lesson that Toyota learned. Building a car depends on its weakest link. So helping the small supplier catch up in terms of its ability to produce well, to high quality, to the right cost, everybody benefits. Doing that across an ecosystem, everybody wins. But it is about managing partnerships and collaboration. And it's about sharing that value, aligning complementary assets, and recognizing in an ecosystem there may be some rather strange bedfellows. It's perhaps not so well known that many of the components underneath Apple's iPhone are in fact manufactured by its chief competitor, Samsung. If you take Netflix, in the world of entertainment, a clear ecosystem delivering all sorts of valued experiences in our homes, but one of its big competitors in that world would of course be Amazon with its Prime offering. So you might see them as two competing systems, except they also, within those networks, find themselves as strange bedfellows. Netflix's big operation runs on Amazon's servers. So we've got a strange situation again of shared value and bringing complementary assets together. But it is very much about common cause and shared purpose. Whether we're trying to enable scale like Let's Localize, or diffuse process innovations like Toyota, or grow a different kind of business like Amazon. Essentially, ecosystems are about common cause and shared purpose, moving together to scale. If we think of the fourth insight, this is another academic term about appropriability. But what that word really means is how are we able to capture and hold on to the value? Now, of course, one way we might think of this is let's protect. Let's put a patent if we can, or a copyright or a trademark. Let's protect what it is we've worked so hard to do, and then we'll hold the value that way. May not always work. The MP3 that I mentioned earlier, which is the device or the software which allows us to have music wherever we go, essentially is something that was developed by the German Fraunhofer Integrated Circuit Research Group down in Nuremberg in Germany. They held the patent and they developed the technology and tried to scale it, just like our earlier examples, with very little success. However, the people who did manage to scale it were these gentlemen, a small company called Nullsoft, which produced a player called Winamp, and very quickly realized that Winamp's big popularity was it enabled a lot of students and others to share their music, to make copies and to share all of it illegally. And Napster built a business further, moving very, very rapidly to become a key player, again, in the world of illegal file sharing. Now, what happened there was a move to scale where the control of the technology was not enough to move to scale. Instead, riding a wave of social movements around sharing files, a peer-to-peer world, did enable scale. Now, I'm not advocating for a moment breaking the law. Nonetheless, the message is that maybe just having the tight protection doesn't necessarily guarantee we generate the value at scale or hold on to it. And that's a lesson that Lego learned rather well. Lego, of course, with a great product and a lot of very good trademarks and other things to protect it, you might expect could behave in a way which wanted to hold on to the value. Lego, however, created a product called Mindstorms to bring their bricks into the 21st century by making them programmable, allowing boys and girls to build all sorts of intelligent models. Their product Mindstorms was a great product, but it was very quickly hacked. What Lego did, instead of trying to find the culprits and sue them and block them, was to invite them to join in. They flew them over to Denmark. They got their software engineers to sit alongside them. Working with the hackers, they were able to improve the product. And through improving the product, they were also able to move it much more rapidly to a much bigger market. They generated scale. And they learned the value of opening up so that their latest offering with their bricks and their other elements essentially says to their market, still boys and girls on the main, via their website, please share your design ideas. What can you do? What have you done with Lego? And let's use that to generate interest amongst other people, and together we'll share in the benefits. They've blurred the line between the designers, the innovators, and the market. And in doing so, they've moved things to scale. These days, we're in a world of open innovation. That's a phrase we've had for the last 10 years or so, but it really describes a very different innovation environment. One where phrases like give to get, or use our stuff to build your stuff, they're all about growing markets and growing opportunities through opening and sharing. Use our stuff to build your stuff was a phrase the BBC used when they were trying to work with all sorts of programmers coming up with all sorts of new ways of entering what was going to be the hugely expanding world of internet delivery of broadcast services. So the BBC, rather than trying to control everything, said, look, we've got technology, we've got ideas, we've got things here, but why don't you use our stuff to build your stuff? Let's put these two together and see what we might come up with. And that approach, of course, extends into communities like Linux, the software which is powering all of our smartphones. Linux is essentially a community of open innovators, sharing their stuff, giving to get, creating shared value, not about ownership by a single corporation. And that really opens up the kind of thing we saw a little bit in the MP3 example, the power of what we might call the hackerverse, the world in which many, many people in this digital space can now contribute, and how we might amplify and build on network effects. In the field of social innovation, that's quite important. The challenge in social innovation is not about controlling something, about owning it. It's trying to get diffusion of good ideas as far and as fast as possible. And so here, we're very much interested in what we might call positive hacking in order to move things to scale. The last point, the last set of insights are around people, because innovation is a people process in the end. It's not just about things and markets and business models, it's about people. On the inside, a lesson we've learned over many, many years. Growing organizations for scale means those organizations have to change. What works for a startup isn't going to be the model we're going to need as we move to scale. In particular, we're going to need different skills and very possibly different organization structures. There's a lot of famous research looking at how organizations move from being small startups to growing to the sort of global scale that some of ours have become. And the research really points to a number of turning points. A crisis, the Greek word means turning point, but these are recognizable points where things have to change. We can't simply do things in the same old way. There's just too much going on. We have to differentiate and we have to coordinate in different fashion. One of the consequences of that, and it's picked up in this particular picture, is that the founders may need to let go. We may need different people to help move things to scale. This is a very famous picture. It's a cartoon from the Punch magazine about Germany. And the man descending the ladder, and the metaphor is of dropping the pilot. The man is Bismarck. He'd steered Germany from a series of small states to a unified large European country, but it was time for him to get off and let the country take its own destiny forward. But as a metaphor, it's quite powerful for thinking about what we may need to do as we move to scale in terms of the people and the organization. But it's also all about people on the outside. Diffusion of innovation to scale, above all else, is a social process. We discussed it earlier, thinking about Roger's work, this idea that innovation moves through people. It's how people talk about innovation, how some people are influential on others in terms of deciding whether or not to adopt something. This is a social process, and it has a number of implications. One of them is what's called social identity theory, and that's basically who we are and the group we belong to. And a principle called homophily, a very academic term, but what it really means is people like us. We like, we trust, we believe people like us. We're not so keen on things when they come from people who are not like us. Now, many examples of innovations moving to scale or not can be traced back to this problem. There's a phenomenon in many companies called not invented here. where an otherwise smart organization rejects an idea, apparently a good innovation, because it comes from outside. It's not been invented here. And that accounts for many, many interesting stories, not least why Kodak rejected Edwin Land's offer of the instant photography process. But basically, not invented here can be explained in terms of organizations which tend to refer to themselves and the people like us, and which are less trusting of things coming from outside. That, of course, plays out very much in the social space, and it was something that Brownie Wise understood in the Tupperware context. Essentially, what she was doing there was saying, there are people like us at the Tupperware party, and that's why we can talk about, we can experiment, and we'll probably trust the idea enough to try it out ourselves. So it's essentially a model where people like us and the social processes play a key role. And that leads us to think about social influence, because it isn't just we trust other people. There are some particular people we're very interested in, the ones whose opinions matter to us, the opinion leaders. In today's Instagram world, they're the influencers. But this is not a new idea. Innovation diffusion has always followed this kind of multi-step social pattern. So we see a lot in discussion of crossing the chasm, of moving from the early stages of adoption to large-scale adoption, how we cross over that chasm. We see there the role of individuals acting as intermediaries, or of groups of people, like those at the Tupperware party, networking and sharing ideas with each other and collectively deciding to move forward and try something new out. So, I've talked for far too long. Let me try and summarize some key points, these insights, and there are many others, around managing our journey to scale. First point, an obvious one, innovation is a long haul. The idea is just the first starting point, but launching the product, the service, whatever it is, having proved it and tested and prototyped it, launching it, we're still only halfway. Moving it to scale is the next part of that journey. We need to have a plan for where we're going and how we're going to get there, who we need and when they come on board. We need a strategy just as much as we need that at startup, so we need it to help us with our journey to scale. And we talk a lot about crossing chasms or building bridges or putting stepping stones in place, essentially breaking down that challenge into manageable chunks and working out the resources that we might need to pull together to make that, or to construct that bridge, or to cross that chasm. The good news, as I said from the beginning, we've got a lot of useful insights and approaches we can take from the past. But we do need not to simply pull them off the shelf and dust them off and use them. We need to explore them and extend them. How else might we use them, particularly in today's digital world where communication is so much faster and so much more widespread? And perhaps one of the key lessons as part of our process of moving to scale is the idea of the pivot. Instead of having the master plan and pushing forward, that is the way we're going, to probe a little, to move on to the next stepping stone and learn from what happens. Adapt our idea, to pivot, to keep the general sense of direction, but to change what we're doing. This idea of being agile and pivoting is absolutely central, again, not just in the startup development stage, but certainly in the journey to scale. So it's what we academics call the need for dynamic capability. Keep on stepping back, retuning, resetting, learning new tricks. So let me conclude by bringing this gentleman in to help make the final point. Learning isn't always easy, and this is my advisor here, Mr. Christopher Robin, and particularly Mr. Edward Bear, Winnie the Pooh, that's his proper name. The very first page of the very first book says something very powerful about this problem of learning. Here we have Edward Bear coming downstairs, bump, 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 on the back of his head behind Christopher Robin, which is, as far as he knows, the only way of coming downstairs. But sometimes he feels there really is another way, if only he could stop bumping for a moment to think of it. That's the challenge. We do want to learn, of course. It's just rather difficult to do when we're out there bumping our heads. Thankfully, you've taken a little time to watch and listen to this. I hope that in the process, you've eased some of that pain of bumping your heads, and maybe there are one or two new insights that might help you in your journey forward. Thank you very much.